August 19, 1942. The pebble beaches of Dieppe, France. The rising sun struggles to pierce the thick, acrid smoke blanketing the coastline. The sound is a symphony of industrial-scale slaughter, the relentless chatter of German MG-42s, the deafening crump of mortar shells, and the agonizing groans of crushed steel as landing craft founder in the surf. From the deck of the destroyer, HMS Calpe, Chief of Combined Operations, Lord Louis Mountbatten, watches through his binoculars as Operation Jubilee disintegrates into a catastrophe. He sees the Churchill tanks of the 14th Canadian Army Tank Regiment, meant to be the steel spearhead of the assault, unable to gain purchase on the steep, shingled beaches. Their tracks spin uselessly, grinding stone against stone, turning them into static, helpless targets for the German anti-tank guns hidden in the cliffs. Mountbatten lowers his binoculars, the grim reality settling in his stomach like lead. For months, his planners had argued that the key to any future invasion of Europe was the immediate capture of a major port, a deep-water harbor like Cherbourg or Le Havre, with its established quays, cranes, and infrastructure, essential for unloading the tidal wave of men, machines, and supplies needed to sustain a modern army. Dieppe was the test case, a full-dress rehearsal for a port assault. And it is an unmitigated disaster. The commando raids on the flanking headlands have faltered. The main infantry assault is pinned on the beach, being systematically cut to pieces. The tanks are burning. The price for a direct attack on a fortified harbor, it is now terrifyingly clear, is to be paid in thousands of lives and mountains of wrecked equipment, for little to no gain. He can hear the frantic radio chatter, desperate calls for support, reports of impassable seawalls, the chilling silence where a voice used to be. Every piece of intelligence confirms the same brutal lesson. Hitler's Atlantic Wall is not a bluff. The Germans would defend their ports to the last man, and they would demolish them into useless rubble before allowing them to fall into Allied hands. As the order for a full withdrawal is finally given, leaving behind nearly 4,000 casualties and a beach littered with the smoking carcasses of a failed invasion, a single horrifying question hangs in the air for Mountbatten and the Allied High Command. If they could not capture a port, how in God's name were they going to supply the millions of men required to liberate Europe? The invasion, the entire strategy for defeating Germany, suddenly seems impossible. The problem isn't just getting ashore. It's staying ashore. Without a port, an army would wither and die on the vine. Back in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill receives the grim reports. His reaction is not one of despair, but of defiant, almost unreasonable demand. He had famously scribbled a note to Mountbatten months earlier. Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. It seemed like a fantasy. Now, in the bloody aftermath of Dieppe, it has become an absolute necessity. The message is clear. If they cannot take a port from the enemy, they will have to bring one with them. The demand landed like a thrown gauntlet in the hushed wood-paneled offices of the War Office and the Admiralty. Bring a port with them. To the old guard, it was madness, a civilian politician's fanciful dream, utterly detached from the brutal realities of engineering and naval warfare. But in the desperate winter of 1942, madness was a commodity in high demand. The task fell to a motley collection of Britain's most brilliant and often most eccentric minds. One such mind belonged to Professor John Desmond Bernal, a physicist, a crystallographer, and an avowed communist, whose sheer intellectual firepower was too valuable for the establishment to ignore. Bernal, with his untamed hair and perpetually rumpled suit, thought on a scale that dwarfed conventional military planning. His mind raced past simple piers and jetties. His early audacious proposal, codenamed Project Habakkuk, even suggested towing a fleet of colossal artificial icebergs to serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers in landing stages. The idea was ultimately deemed impractical, but it shattered the intellectual confines of the problem, forcing everyone to think bigger, to think impossibly. The practical burden of turning these wild concepts into steel and concrete fell to men like Brigadier Bruce White, a dour, methodical Royal Engineer with a lifetime of experience in civilian port construction. Where Bernal saw theoretical physics, White saw tons of aggregate stress tolerances and the unforgiving power of a Channel gale. He assembled a team under the innocuous title of Transportation 5, or TN5, setting up shop far from the prying eyes of Whitehall. In clandestine meetings over countless cups of tea and amidst clouds of pipe smoke, The anatomy of a portable harbor began to take shape on blueprints and chalkboards. They were not designing a single object, but an entire ecosystem, a series of interlocking solutions to a cascade of seemingly unsolvable problems. First, the raw power of the Atlantic had to be tamed. How could they create a patch of calm water in the middle of a churning sea? The answer was a breakwater, but on a scale never before imagined. This gave birth to the Phoenixes, gargantuan hollow concrete caissons, each the size of a 6-story apartment building weighing over 6,000 tons. They would be built in dry docks and along river estuaries all across Britain, sealed with watertight valves. On D-Day, these concrete leviathans would be flooded and sunk in a precise line miles offshore, forming the solid spine of the artificial harbor's outer wall. To supplement them, a line of floating breakwaters, steel cruciform structures called bombardons, would be moored further out to sea, absorbing the first shock of the waves. Second was the problem of the tide. The Normandy beaches had a tidal range of over 20 feet. A fixed pier would be a uselessly high platform at low tide and completely submerged at high tide. The solution was breathtaking in its elegance, a floating roadway. They designed hundreds of 80-foot steel bridge sections codenamed whales, with cunning articulation joints that allowed them to flex and move with the swell of the sea. These roadway sections would rest on floating pontoons called beetles, creating a steel serpent that snaked from the shore to the deep water, constantly rising and falling with the tide. Finally, the pierhead itself, the point where ships would actually unload their cargo. This needed to be a stable platform, immune to the vertical motion of the waves. The result was the spud pierhead, a large floating pontoon equipped with 4 enormous steel legs. Like a colossal water insect, it would be towed into position, where its spud legs would be jacked down, driving themselves into the seabed until the platform was raised clear of the water, creating a fixed, stable island of steel in the middle of their man-made lagoon. It was a harbor, deconstructed into its essential components, reimagined as a gigantic seafaring kit. The plans were approved. The theory was sound. Now all they had to do was build it, the largest, most complex marine construction project in history, and do it in absolute secrecy, right under the nose of the enemy. Across the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, a secret, industrial war began in the winter of 1943. The grand, impossible designs conceived in London were now fractured into thousands of individual blueprints and sent out to over 200 different civilian engineering firms. This decentralization was the masterstroke of the plan's secrecy. No single worker, no single factory would have the complete picture. From the bustling shipyards of the River Clyde to the quiet estuaries of the South Coast, a silent army of over 40,000 laborers was mobilized. They were welders, carpenters, riveters, and concrete specialists, ordinary men and women who were told only that their work was vital for the war effort. In dredged-out basins and specially excavated dry docks, the great Phoenix caissons began to take shape. The scale of the work was staggering. Day and night, a river of lorries delivered mountains of sand and aggregate, the air filled with the grinding roar of concrete mixers and the sharp clang of steel on steel. Foremen shouted orders over the din as massive cranes hoisted reinforcing bars into place, creating steel skeletons that were then entombed in thousands of tons of concrete. To the workers, they were just building enormous hollow concrete boxes. Some speculated they were storage barges, others defensive sea forts. None could have guessed they were building the walls of a harbor destined for the coast of France. These sites were a constant source of anxiety for the planners. German reconnaissance flights, the dreaded recce birds, were an ever-present threat. The solution was to hide these behemoths in plain sight. Many dry docks were intentionally kept flooded, so the rising walls of the caissons remained below ground level, invisible from the air. At Richborough in Kent, a massive construction pit was excavated, only to be flooded as the Phoenixes grew, camouflaging them as inland lakes. Simultaneously, in steel fabrication yards across the country, the other components were being born. The 80-foot-long whale roadway sections were assembled like giant Meccano sets, their intricate steel trusses promising a flexibility that seemed to defy their industrial origins. On the Thames, boat builders who once specialized in pleasure craft now found themselves welding the strange cruciform bombardon breakwaters. And in quiet corners of major ports, the spud pierheads were fitted out, their towering steel legs giving them the appearance of bizarre, multi-limbed sea creatures. It was a phantom fleet, an arsenal of harbor components being built piece by piece, their true purpose a mystery to the very hands that shaped them. By the spring of 1944, the work was reaching its climax. As each component was completed, it was discreetly floated out of its construction basin. Under the cover of darkness, tugboats guided the newly born concrete and steel giants to secret anchorages and estuaries, primarily around Selseybill and Dungeness. There they waited, a vast, silent armada of abstract shapes bobbing gently in the coastal waters. The pieces of the impossible puzzle were finished, scattered and hidden. Now they awaited the signal, the order to move to cross the world's most heavily defended body of water, and to assemble under enemy fire. June 5, 1944. The Solent, off the Isle of Wight. The sea is a churning mass of gray steel, a traffic jam of unprecedented scale as the D-Day invasion fleet steams for Normandy. But trailing behind the destroyers, the landing ships, and the troop transports is another fleet, stranger than anything the sea has ever borne. On the bridge of his deep-sea tug, the Thames, Captain Daniel Scott watches the tow line stretch taut, groaning under a strain he can still barely comprehend. Behind him, a monstrous block of gray concrete, a phoenix caisson, plows stubbornly through the waves. It handles like a floating mountain, and at a terrifyingly slow 4 knots, his tug is a fat, sluggish target for any German E-boat or U-boat that might find them. His fleet, Force C, is an ad hoc collection of 150 tugboats, some requisitioned, from as far away as the United States, crewed by civilian mariners who now find themselves on the front line of the invasion. Their mission is one of the most critical and most perilous of the entire operation. They are to shepherd the dismembered pieces of 2 entire harbors across one of the world's most treacherous and heavily defended bodies of water. The journey is agonizingly slow. The concrete phoenixes sit low in the water, their massive bulk displacing huge amounts of water, making steering a constant battle against the current and wind. The floating whale roadways, strung out behind their own tugs, undulate on the waves, like wounded sea serpents threatening to snap their lines with every large swell. The journey is a masterclass in seamanship, a slow-motion ballet of immense forces. Overhead, RAF Spitfires and P-51 Mustangs provide a protective canopy, their pilots looking down in disbelief at the bizarre procession below. From the air, the components look like abstract sculptures adrift on the channel. The German command, when they receive scattered reports of strange concrete structures being towed south, dismiss them as block ships, intended to be sunk at the entrances to French ports. They cannot conceive of the true, audacious purpose of this concrete armada. The deception that had begun in the construction yards was now holding fast in the crucible of the English Channel. As they approached the coast of Normandy on the morning of June 7th, D-Day +1, the sounds of battle carry across the water, the distant, percussive thump of artillery and the drone of aircraft. The crews on the tugs, exhausted after the 30-hour crossing, see the coastline shrouded in smoke. They are sailing into a war zone with the most unwieldy, most valuable, and most vulnerable cargo imaginable. Their arrival marks the end of the first impossible phase of the plan. But now the second and perhaps most dangerous phase is about to begin, assembling a harbor piece by piece on a hostile shore, with the enemy watching from the cliffs above. June 8, 1944. Off the coast of Arromanches, Normandy. For the combat engineers of the British Royal Engineers and the U.S. Navy Seabees, the real work is just beginning. They are not soldiers of assault but of construction, yet their workplace is a battlefield. The sea is littered with the debris of the invasion, and the air still echoes with the crump of distant shelling. Their task is to take the colossal, scattered pieces of the concrete armada and, under the gaze of German artillery observers on the ridgelines, assemble 2 functioning harbors, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach for the Americans, and Mulberry B at Arromanches for the British and Canadians. It's like trying to build a watch in the middle of a hurricane. The first step is to create an initial breakwater. A line of old obsolete warships and merchant ships, codenamed corncobs, are steamed into position and then systematically scuttled by demolition charges, settling onto the sandy seabed to form a reef known as a gooseberry. Within this sliver of calmer water, the main event begins. Royal Navy survey boats dart across the waves, marking the exact pre-planned locations for each Phoenix caisson with buoys. The margin for error is less than a few feet. Then comes the delicate, brutal dance of the tugs. They nudge and wrestle the 6,000-ton concrete behemoths into their designated spots. On board the caissons, a skeleton crew of Royal Engineers stands ready. On the order, they open the seacocks. With a great hiss of escaping air and a surge of foaming water, the sea rushes into the hollow chambers. The massive structure shudders, groans, and begins its controlled descent. Within minutes, the concrete giant that crossed a sea is now part of the seabed, a permanent fixture on the French coast, creating another segment of the harbor's main wall. One by one, they are sunk in a precise curving line, a testament to the surveyor's skill and the tug captain's nerve. Next, the floating piers, the whales, are towed into position. Engineers in small boats clamber over the heaving steel pontoons, connecting the 80-foot roadway sections, linking them from the shore out to the newly installed spud pierheads, which now stand on their steel legs above the waves. It is perilous work. They are completely exposed to enemy fire. German long-range guns from Le Havre periodically shell the construction sites, sending up geysers of water. The engineers work on, knowing that every connection made, every bolt tightened, brings the Allied armies one step closer to the supplies they desperately need to break out from the beachhead. Slowly, impossibly, against all odds and under the constant threat of enemy action, two harbors are rising from the sea. June 18, 1944. Arromanches, Mulberry B. By D-Day +12, the impossible has become routine. The sounds of construction have been replaced by the steady 24-hour roar of a functioning port. The British harbor at Arromanches, officially christened Port Winston, is a miracle of military logistics. Liberty ships, their holds filled with the vital resources of war, carefully navigate the deep water channel and tie up alongside the stable spud pierheads. On the decks, cranes swing into action, their winches groaning as they lift nets bulging with ammunition crates, fuel drums, and medical supplies, lowering them onto the steady platforms. From there, the lifeblood of the Army flows. Convoys of American-made GMC and Bedford trucks drive directly off the landing ship. Tanks, LSTs, their tires rumbling onto the steel whale roadways. They snake their way towards the shore, rising and falling gently with the tide. A ceaseless conveyor belt of men and machinery. For the soldiers on the beachhead, who had spent the first week scrambling for every crate of bullets and every fuel can landed precariously in the surf, the sight is nothing short of miraculous. The chaos of an amphibious landing has been replaced by the organized efficiency of a modern commercial port that, just 2 weeks ago, did not exist. The numbers are staggering. At Mulberry B, the Royal Engineers are soon exceeding the planned target of 7,000 tons of supplies per day. Its American counterpart at Omaha Beach, Mulberry A, is equally busy. Together, they are the twin hearts pumping men and materiel into the Normandy lodgment, allowing the Allied armies to build up overwhelming force for the breakout. Without them, the invasion force would have been starved, an army tethered to the whims of the weather, unable to advance beyond the beaches. Now, with a secure and reliable logistical pipeline, General Montgomery and General Bradley can plan their next moves with confidence. The tide of war in France is turning, not just because of the soldiers' bravery, but because of the sheer overwhelming weight of supplies landing every hour. For a few brief, glorious days, the great gamble has paid off. The engineers have defeated the enemy and the sea itself, but the English Channel, the old unforgiving adversary, has not yet had its final say. On the evening of June 18th, the barometer begins to fall. June 19th, 1944, the English Channel. The storm did not arrive with sudden fury, but with a slow, menacing build. It began as a freshening northeasterly wind, which soon grew into a stiff gale. By midday, the sea, which had been tamed by the engineers' breakwaters, began to rebel. Waves that had been mere ripples grew into powerful, white-capped swells that crashed against the Phoenix caissons with the force of artillery shells. The sky turned a bruised slate gray and a driving rain began to fall. This was no summer squall. This was the worst June storm the Channel had seen in over 40 years. For 3 days, nature unleashed its full fury on the man-made harbors. The outer line of floating bombardon breakwaters, the first line of defense, was the first to fail. They were tossed about like toys, snapping their massive anchor chains. Many were sunk, while others were transformed into multi-ton wrecking balls. careening into the main harbor structures. Ships that had been safely moored were ripped from their anchors, crashing into the piers and each other. The steel whale roadways buckled and twisted under the strain, the groaning of their metal audible even over the roar of the wind. The American harbor, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach, suffered the most. Built on a more exposed stretch of coastline with a sandy, shifting seabed, it faced the storm's onslaught head-on. The great Phoenix caissons, which had seemed so permanent, were lifted and dropped by the mountainous waves, cracking their concrete backs. Entire sections of the pier were ripped away and smashed into unrecognizable tangles of steel. The harbor that had taken thousands of men weeks to build was being systematically dismantled by the sea in a matter of hours. At Port Winston, the British harbor at Arromanches, the situation was equally desperate, but the harbor's slightly more sheltered location and rockier seabed offered it a fighting chance. Still, the damage was immense. For 3 days and nights, the men who had built the harbor fought a losing battle against the storm, watching helplessly as their triumph of engineering was pounded into ruin. By the time the storm finally blew itself out on June 22nd, the scene was one of utter devastation. Mulberry A was a complete write-off, an unsalvageable wreck. The Allied invasion once again teetered on the brink of logistical collapse. June 22, 1944, Omaha Beach. As the sea calmed, the true scale of the disaster became horrifyingly clear. The American harbor, Mulberry A, was a total loss. Its breakwater was breached, its piers were a twisted graveyard of steel, and its roadways were smashed. For the American forces who were preparing to launch their breakout offensive, Operation Cobra, it was a catastrophic blow. A grim-faced General Omar Bradley surveyed the wreckage and made the only decision possible. Mulberry A was to be abandoned. The great American harbor, the product of so much ingenuity and labor, was now just a pile of scrap on a French beach. But defeat was not an option. In one of the great unsung feats of Allied cooperation, a new plan was immediately put into action. If they couldn't save the American harbor, they would use its corpse to save the British one. The U.S. Navy Seabees and Army engineers, the very men who had built Mulberry A, now became its salvagers. The mission was to cannibalize every usable component from the wreckage at Omaha and use them to repair and reinforce the battered but still standing Port Winston at Arromanches. An incredible salvage operation began. Tugs carefully pulled intact sections of whale roadway from the tangled debris. Floating cranes lifted what remained of the pierheads. Anything that could be refloated was painstakingly towed 15 miles down the coast to Arromanches, where Royal Engineers worked around the clock. The effort was relentless. Within days, Port Winston was not just repaired. It was stronger than before. Its capacity was expanded with the American components, its defenses against the sea bolstered. What had been a strategic disaster was transformed by sheer grit and ingenuity into a symbol of Allied resolve. Port Winston now stood alone, the single most important strategic asset on the continent. The logistical hopes of the entire Allied invasion now rested on this one, battered, salvaged, and resilient harbor. August 1944, Normandy, France. As Allied armies finally broke out of the Normandy beachhead, beginning their lightning race across France, they were sustained by a single artery. Port Winston, the survivor, the hybrid of British design and American salvage, became the logistical engine of victory. For the next 5 months, it performed beyond its designer's wildest dreams. Freed from the constraints of landing supplies on open beaches, the Allies could now unleash the full might of their industrial power. Day after day, the port offloaded an average of 9,000 tons of materiel, everything from tanks and artillery pieces to boots, bullets, and blood plasma. This single, temporary harbor became the busiest port in the world. It was the crucial factor that allowed Montgomery's 21st Army Group and Bradley's 12th Army Group to maintain the momentum of their advance. Without the ceaseless flow of fuel and ammunition from Port Winston, the breakout from Normandy, the brutal fighting in the Falaise Pocket, and the triumphant liberation of Paris would have been impossible. It was the unsung hero of the campaign, a weapon forged not of high explosives but of concrete and steel, ingenuity and resolve. By the time the deepwater port of Antwerp was captured and cleared in late 1944, Port Winston's job was done. Over its 10 months of operation, It had landed over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. It was quietly decommissioned, its purpose served. Today, the scars of this incredible achievement remain. The hulking, seaweed-covered forms of its phoenix caissons still sit off the coast of Arromanches, a permanent, silent monument to the engineers who were told to build the impossible, and did.